2 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was plowing through a heavy swell when the first ghost appeared on the tactical displays in the Combat Information Center. The carrier had been maintaining a high state of readiness for 48 hours, but the sheer density of the incoming signal was unlike anything the air warfare officers had ever encountered in 3 decades of service. Within seconds, the question was no longer if an attack was coming, but if any ship in the strike group could stop 100 targets moving as a single, coordinated mind. The night air was thick with the humidity of the Indian Ocean, smelling of salt and the faint ozone scent of high-powered electronics. Below the flight deck, the massive hull of the carrier groaned as it adjusted course to put the wind over its bow. Inside the Combat Information Center, the blue light from the large screen displays illuminated the faces of the operators. The atmosphere was one of forced, professional calm, even as the radar bloom grew in size and intensity. The ANSP-WINE radar systems on the escorting cruiser were the first to resolve the clutter into individual track numbers, each one a potential kinetic threat moving at 180 kilometers per hour. These were not the high-speed anti-ship missiles the crew had trained for, but something more difficult to manage. A massive swarm of foreign military loitering munitions, launched in waves from the coast of the Makran region. The commanding officer of the aircraft carrier stood at the center of the room, watching the numbers climb from 12 to 40 and then to over 80 distinct contacts. The drones were flying less than 30 meters above the water, using the curvature of the Earth and the clutter of the wavetops to mask their approach. On the tactical screen, they looked like a literal cloud of digital insects, slowly but surely closing the gap between the shoreline and the carrier strike group. The distance was 120 kilometers in closing. General Quarters. General Quarters. The announcement echoed through the narrow passageways of the 5,000-man ship. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. The sound of the alarm was a rhythmic, piercing wail that instantly transformed the interior of the ship from a place of rest to a machine of war. In the hangar bay, sailors sprinted toward the ready rooms, while on the flight deck, the yellow-shirted handlers began the frantic process of prepping the Alert 15 aircraft for immediate launch. The iron smell of jet fuel and the roar of the auxiliary power units filled the air as 2 jet fighter aircraft were towed onto the catapults. To the east of the carrier, the escorting cruiser took the lead as the primary air defense commander for the strike group. Its combat system began the complex process of prioritizing targets within the swarm. The computer was forced to calculate the trajectories of nearly 100 low, slow, small targets simultaneously, a task that pushed the processing power of the system to its design limits. Every drone was a small, carbon fiber aircraft carrying 30 kilograms of high explosives, and they were approaching from 3 different headings to split the focus of the defensive screen. At 2:15 in the morning, the first command was given to engage. The cruiser was the first to fire, the vertical launch system on its forward deck erupting in a pillar of white flame and gray smoke. The Standard Missile 2 roared into the night sky, its rocket motor illuminating the sea for miles before it arched over and began its terminal dive toward the leading edge of the foreign military swarm. 5 seconds later, a second missile followed, then a third. The battle for the survival of the aircraft carrier had begun, not with a single explosion, but with a series of distant, muffled thuds, as the first interceptors found their marks far over the horizon. On the flight deck of the carrier, the first jet fighter aircraft was hooked into the catapult shuttle. The pilot felt the massive vibration of the steam piston building pressure beneath him, a physical force that made the entire cockpit shudder. With a sharp salute to the deck officer, the pilot braced his head against the seat. The catapult fired, flinging the 30-ton aircraft from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds. As the jet cleared the bow and retracted its landing gear, the pilot looked at his radar screen. It was almost entirely white. He was flying directly into the heart of the largest drone swarm in history. 2:20 in the morning. The cruiser CG-67, the Philippine Sea, and the destroyer DDG-87, the Mason, were positioned 5 miles apart, forming a lethal picket line 20 miles ahead of the carrier. Both ships had transitioned to an automated engagement mode, allowing the Aegis combat system to manage the incoming swarm with a speed no human operator could match. The air on the bridge of the cruiser was cold and smelled of ozone, while outside, the deck shuddered with the mechanical force of 100 systems coming alive at once. The forward Mark 41 vertical launch systems on both escort ships began a continuous, rhythmic cycle of fire. One after another, the armored hatches flipped open, followed immediately by a deafening roar as a Standard Missile 6 climbed out of its cell on a pillar of white-hot flame. The missiles cleared the deck at 3-second intervals, their rocket motors illuminating the sea for miles and casting long, flickering shadows against the hulls of the ships. The night sky over the North Arabian Sea was no longer black. It was a complex lattice of white exhaust trails reaching toward the northern horizon, each one representing a multi-million-dollar interceptor searching for a $30,000 drone. The AN/SP-1 radar arrays on the cruiser were processing thousands of data points every second, tracking the Iranian swarm as it crossed the 75-kilometer mark. The tactical officers in the Combat Information Center watched the large screen displays as the computer assigned a unique track number to every individual drone. The cooperative engagement capability allowed the destroyer, DDG-87, to fire its missiles. Based on the radar data provided by the cruiser, a seamless handoff of lethal information that ensured no two interceptors targeted the same drone. At a range of 60 kilometers, the first impacts occurred. On the radar screens, the dense cluster of red icons began to flicker and disappear. In the distance, tiny orange flashes blinked against the dark sky, appearing like dying stars. Each flash was the result of a Standard Missile 6 proximity fuse detonating, sending thousands of tungsten pellets through the carbon fiber frames of the Shahed drones. At coordinates 24 degrees 15 minutes north, 105 degrees 2 minutes east, the first wave of 30 drones was obliterated in less than 90 seconds. However, the professional calm in the Combat Information Center began to shift as the radar updated the remaining contacts. Despite the success of the initial interception, the sheer volume of the attack was becoming an inescapable reality. For every drone destroyed by a Standard missile, 3 more seemed to emerge from the radar clutter of the coast. The Iranian commanders were launching in staggered intervals, ensuring that the American defensive screen was never given a moment to reset or reload. The deck of the cruiser CG-67 continued to vibrate as more missiles left their cells. The smell of burning propellant was now thick in the air, a sharp chemical bite that seeped into the ship's ventilation system. The temperature on the missile deck had risen to nearly 400 degrees, the steel plates groaning under the thermal stress of the repeated launches. The tactical situation was reaching a saturation point. The cruiser and the destroyer had already expended 40% of their long-range missile inventory, yet the primary mass of the swarm was still 50 kilometers away and closing fast. The swarm began to change its behavior, a sign that the Iranian ground controllers were adjusting their tactics in real time. The remaining drones dropped even lower to the water, some flying at an altitude of only 5 meters above the waves. This maneuver exploited the sea clutter phenomenon, where the radar energy reflects off the wave tops, making it difficult for the Aegis system to maintain a lock on a small, slow-moving target. The red icons on the American screens began to jitter and fade, momentarily lost in the digital noise of the ocean. "They are hugging the deck," the air warfare officer reported, his voice tight but steady. "We are losing track quality on the trailing elements, switching to high-frequency surface search modes." The commander of the strike group, watching from the bridge of the Eisenhower, looked out toward the horizon. He could see the distant flashes of the interceptions, but he could also see the gaps where the drones were getting through. The outer screen had done its job, but it was not enough. The saturation of the defense was nearly complete. The long-range phase of the battle was ending, and the swarm was about to enter the inner defensive bubble, where the engagement would become a matter of seconds rather than minutes. 2:30 in the morning, 10,000 feet above the Arabian Sea, the lead FA-18 Super Hornet of Strike Fighter, Squadron 32, banked hard into a 90-degree turn, its twin engines screaming against the thin night air. Below the canopy, The black expanse of the ocean was broken only by the distant, rhythmic flashes of the cruiser's missile launches, appearing like heat lightning. On a summer night, the pilot, call sign Swordsman 1, adjusted his oxygen mask as the high G turn pressed his body into the seat, his eyes locked on the green glow of the heads-up display. The cockpit was bathed in the dim red glow of the instrument panel, and the air inside the pilot's mask tasted of dry, recycled oxygen and a hint of sweat. Outside, the cold wind hissed past, the Lexan canopy at 800 kilometers per hour. A constant, low-frequency roar that served as the backdrop to the chaotic chatter on the tactical radio circuit. 4 Super Hornets were now on station, positioned in a CAP, a combat air patrol designed to catch the drones that had managed to fly beneath the radar coverage of the escort ships. Swordsman 1, this is Eagle Eye, the voice of the E-2 Charlie. Hawkeye controller crackled in his headset. You have a massive cluster of low-slow targets at your 12 o'clock. Range 15 miles. They are grouped in a wedge formation, altitude 50 feet. You are cleared to engage, weapons free. The pilot toggled his radar to the air-to-ground sea clutter mode, trying to isolate the tiny carbon fiber signatures from the rolling whitecaps of the sea. On the glass display, dozens of small green triangles began to flicker into existence. There were so many targets that the computer struggled to provide a clean firing solution for the AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. The foreign military swarm was not flying in a traditional military formation. They were moving in a fluid, shifting mass that mimicked the behavior of a starling murmuration. Fox 2, the pilot called out, squeezing the trigger on the stick. A rail-mounted missile shrieked off the wingtip of the military aircraft, its solid rocket motor leaving a white corkscrew of smoke in the darkness. The infrared seeker head of the missile locked onto the friction heat generated by the leading edge of a drone's propeller. 3 seconds later, a small orange fireball erupted just above the waves. The pilot did not wait to watch the debris hit the water. He was already slewing his sensors to the next target. The 4 Super Hornets worked in pairs, diving from 10,000 feet down to less than 500, their radar altimeters screaming warnings as they leveled off just above the spray of the ocean. The engagement was becoming a frantic, close-quarters hunt. At such low altitudes, the pilots had to contend with the physical vertigo of flying over a featureless Black Sea while simultaneously managing a complex weapons system. Each aircraft carried 2 Sidewinder missiles and 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Within 4 minutes, every missile had been expended. Running dry on heaters, Swordsman 2 reported, his voice tight with the strain of a 5G pullout. Moving to guns. There are still 30 or 40 of them in this sector alone. It is like trying to stop a flood with a handful of pebbles. The lead pilot switched his master arm to gun and selected the M61 A2 Vulcan cannon. He lined up a cluster of 3 drones in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. The nose of the military aircraft vibrated violently as the 6-barrel cannon spun up, spitting 20mm high-explosive, incendiary rounds at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. A stream of tracers reached out into the darkness, chewing through the first drone and sending pieces of burning plastic flying into the path of the second. The smell of burnt gunpowder momentarily bypassed the cockpit filters. A sharp, metallic odor that signaled the intensity of the fight. Despite the skill of the naval aviators, the math of the engagement was turning against them. For every drone they shredded with gunfire, 2 more seemed to slip through the gaps in their formation. The jet fighter aircraft were moving at 500 knots, while the drones were chugging along at barely 100. This speed disparity meant the pilots had only seconds to aim and fire before they overshot the targets and had to circle back for another pass. Eagle Eye. Swordsman 1. The lead pilot radioed, his breath heavy in the mask. We have neutralized approximately 15 targets. but the main body of the swarm has passed our position. They are headed straight for the carrier's inner wake. We cannot reset for another pass-in. Time. The screen is bypassed. The four fighters climbed back into the night sky, their fuel gauges dropping as they transitioned to afterburner to clear the area. Below them, the swarm continued its relentless, low-level flight toward the aircraft carrier. The outer screen had failed to achieve total interception. The final defensive line, consisting of the carrier's own organic weapon systems, was now the only thing standing between 40 suicide drones and the skate 4.5-acre flight deck of the most vital asset. 2:45 in the morning. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was now the center of a shrinking circle of fire. Inside the Combat Information Center, the large-screen displays were a chaotic mosaic of overlapping red icons, each representing a Shahed drone that had survived the outer and middle-tier defenses. The sheer volume of the incoming threat was reaching the saturation limit of the AN/SPY-1 radar arrays, forcing the system to prioritize only the targets with the highest probability of impact. The air in the room was cold, kept at exactly 18 degrees Celsius to protect the massive banks of processors, but the operators were sweating under their flash gear. The Iranian swarm had executed a programmed maneuver, splitting into 3 distinct attack vectors to approach the carrier from the bow, the starboard quarter, and the stern simultaneously. This tactic was designed to overwhelm the fire channels of the AEGIS combat system, which could only guide a certain number of missiles at once. At latitude 24 degrees 12 minutes north, the radar picture became a blur of digital noise as the drones dropped to within 3 meters of the sea surface. The iron smell of the ocean and the humid night air seemed to press against the hull of the carrier, while inside, the hum of the electronics rose to a high-pitched whine. The tactical action officer on the Eisenhower watched as the first group of 40 drones crossed the 15-kilometer mark. This was the inner defensive zone, where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds. The escorting destroyer, the DDG-87 USS Mason, moved to a position 500 meters off the carrier's starboard beam, its hull cutting through the heavy swells and throwing white spray high into the air. The Mason was now the primary shield, its crew prepared to use every weapon in the inventory to keep the carrier's flight deck clear of fire. The swarm is splitting, the sensor supervisor called out, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his professional tone. Vector 1 is crossing the 10-kilometer mark. Vector 2 is coming up from the stern. Vector 3 is masking behind the wavetops at 8 kilometers. The system is struggling to maintain a firm track on the low-altitude targets. The problem was one of physics and processing power. The radar energy was bouncing off the turbulent surface of the North Arabian Sea, creating false positives that the computer had to filter out before it could assign a firing solution. For every real drone, the screen showed 3 ghost images created by sea clutter. The crew of the Eisenhower could hear the distant, heavy thud of the cruiser's 5-inch guns firing at the maximum rate, sending 70-pound shells toward the horizon in a desperate attempt to break the cohesion of the swarm. The sky was lit by the rapid-fire flashes of the artillery, casting a rhythmic, strobing light across the water. Inside the carrier's self-defense center, the officers were forced to take manual control of several weapon stations. The automation of the AEGIS system was being tricked by the low-altitude approach of the drones. On the starboard catwalks, sailors in heavy body armor manned 50-caliber machine guns and M240 Bravo light machine guns, their eyes scanning the black horizon for the faint, glowing exhaust of the drone engines. The wind was whipping across the deck at 30 knots, carrying the sharp scent of diesel and the metallic tang of hot gun barrels. The swarm was now only 5 minutes from impact. The 60 drones that remained were no longer a disorganized cloud. They were a precision instrument of saturation. At 5 kilometers, the automated close-in weapon systems on 10, the carrier and the destroyer, began to slew their radar domes toward the threats. The white domes, looking like oversized robotic heads, moved with a terrifying, mechanical speed, tracking targets that the human eye could not yet see in the darkness. The silence on dawn. The bridge of the Eisenhower was absolute, broken only by the steady, calm reports from the tactical stations. The commanding officer gripped the edge of the chart table, his knuckles white. He knew that the next 60 seconds would determine if his ship would remain a sovereign piece of American territory or become a burning wreck in the middle of the North Arabian Sea. The saturation limit had been reached, and the defense was now down to the final layers of steel and lead. The drones were no longer dots on a screen. They were physical objects of wood, plastic, and high explosives, screaming through the night air toward the 4.5-acre target. 2:50 in the morning. The inner 300 meters. The airspace surrounding the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer a void of night, but a screaming corridor of white tracers and high-velocity lead. The Iranian swarm had reached the final layer of the American defense, a space where the time to react was measured in the heartbeat of a single turbine. On the starboard side of the carrier, the two Mark 15 Phalanx close-in weapon systems began their terminal engagement. The white radomes slewed with a violent, robotic precision, their 20mm Gatling guns spinning up to 6,000 rounds per minute. The trigger was squeezed by the automated logic of the search and track radar. The first close-in weapon system erupted, a continuous 3-second burst that sounded like the tearing of a giant sheet of heavy canvas. A stream of armor-piercing tungsten subprojectiles shrieked off the mount, a solid line of white light, reaching out to meet the first wave of incoming drones. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the faces of the nearby damage control teams, the temperature in the immediate vicinity of the gun rising by 20 degrees in an instant. The air was suddenly thick with the acrid, metallic stink of burnt powder and the ozone of the high-speed electric motors. 200 meters off the starboard quarter, the first drone in the stack was hit. The 20mm rounds punched straight through the plastic nose cone and into the 30-kilogram high-explosive warhead. The drone did not just fall. It erupted instantly into a sphere of orange flame and jagged carbon fiber fragments. The blast wave of the detonation rolled across the water, the pressure slamming into the side of the carrier's hull with a physical weight that could be felt deep in the engine rooms. Two more drones, following close behind in the saturation formation, were shredded by the flying debris of the first, their engines failing as they tumbled into the dark wake of the ship. But the swarm was too dense. Even as the Phalanx system neutralized 5 targets in 10 seconds, 6 more moved into the gap. On the forward part of the island, the rolling airframe missile launcher hissed as it fired 2 interceptors in rapid succession. The missiles left the launcher with a sharp, high-pitched scream, their rocket motors kicking up a cloud of gray smoke that blotted out the signal lights on the flight deck for 3 full seconds. One missile found its target at a range of 400 meters, obliterating a drone in a white flash that bleached the sky for a mile in every direction. The second missile's proximity fuse triggered a fraction of a second late, the blast sending the target into a violent, uncontrolled spin, but failing to stop its forward momentum. The drone, its left wing partially severed and trailing a plume of black smoke, drove into the side of the carrier just below the flight deck level. The impact was not a muffled thud, but a sharp, metallic crash, followed immediately by a roar as the warhead detonated against the steel armor of the hangar bay door. The explosion punched a hole 2 meters wide through the outer skin of the ship, sending a spray of white-hot shrapnel into the interior. The vibration of the hit traveled through the entire 90,000-ton structure of the Eisenhower. A heavy, shuddering jolt that knocked several sailors off their feet in the nearby ready rooms. Immediately after the rebit impact, the scene on the starboard side was one of controlled chaos. Black smoke boiled out of the jagged hole in the hull, lit from within by the orange glow of a localized fire. The air was filled with the sound of metal tearing and the rhythmic, high-frequency thump-thump-thump of the remaining machine gun nests as they continued to fire into the darkness. The first drone had found its mark, and the vacuum created by the explosion was immediately filled by the screams of the damage control whistles and the overlapping reports. on the internal radio net. The swarm was not finished. Even as the first fires began to lick at the edges of the hangar deck, the radar displays showed 20 more red icons closing the final 100 meters. The defense was now a desperate manual struggle between Nuverside, the sailors on the catwalks, and a wave of suicide machines that refused to flinch. The sky was a lattice of fire, and the carrier was no longer just a carrier. It was a target that had been bled, and the predators were closing in for the kill. 2:52 in the morning. The starboard side of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer a wall of gray steel, but a jagged landscape of fire and twisted aluminum. The first impact had breached the hangar bay, but it was merely the opening, note in a symphony of destruction. Following the programmed saturation logic of the Iranian flight controllers, the remaining drones targeted the localized heat signatures of the initial fires. Within 60 seconds, the carrier's primary defensive perimeter had dissolved into a series of individual, desperate duels between point defense gunners and suicide machines. The second wave of 10 drones slammed into the ship in a rapid-fire sequence. One warhead punched through the flight deck near the 30-kilogram charge detonating against the heavy steel plating. The explosion sent a shockwave through the deck that compressed the chests of every sailor within 50 meters, followed immediately by a fireball that bleached the night sky white. 3 parked FA-18 Super Hornets, fueled and armed for the next sortie, were caught in the blast radius. The heat blast, reaching temperatures in the thousands of degrees, ignited the JP-5 jet fuel leaking from a ruptured fuel line, creating a river of fire that began to flow toward the open elevator shaft. Inside the ship, the reaction was instantaneous and disciplined. The Damage Control Central, located deep within the armored time citadel of the carrier, became the nerve center of the struggle for survival. Condition Zebra was already set. Every watertight door and hatch sealed to prevent the struggle to the dime's spread of fire and smoke. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the ship shudder as 3 more drones impacted the starboard sponsons in quick succession. The sound of metal tearing was a constant, low-frequency roar, punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of the 20mm cannons still trying to find targets through the thick black smoke. Fire! Fire! Fire on the flight deck and in Hangar Bay 2. The announcer's voice was calm, even as the alarms screamed in the background. Damage control teams 1 and 5 muster at Station Delta. All hands not involved in firefighting brace for shock. The firefighting teams, dressed in heavy silver proximity suits, moved toward the inferno. They carried the Pone 100 portable pumps and thick hoses, their boots splashing through a mixture of seawater, foam, and jet fuel. The air was a thick, toxic soup of acrid smoke and the chemical bite of burning electronics. Despite the heat, the sailors worked with a mechanical precision, their training taking over where fear attempted to settle. They were fighting to save the most expensive piece of real estate in the American inventory, and they were doing it while the ship was still under active attack. On the flight deck, a team of red shirts, the ordnance-handling crew, risked their lives to move 500-pound bombs away from the spreading fire. The heat was so intense it began to blister the paint on the surrounding bulkheads. One sailor was thrown 15 meters when a drone's lithium battery pack cooked off and exploded. But he was back on his feet in seconds, his face blackened by soot, but his eyes focused on the mission. This was the professional reaction of a crew that had spent months drilling for the worst-case scenario. The immediate aftermath of this wave was a scene of industrial carnage. The starboard side of the Eisenhower was obscured by a massive column of black smoke that rose 500 meters into the air, illuminated from below by the orange pulse of the fires. The ship was listing 3 degrees to starboard as thousands of tons of firefighting water began to pool in the hangar deck. The silence that followed the last drone impact was eerie, broken only by the hiss of the foam nozzles and the distant, muffled thuds of the cruiser's guns still firing at secondary threats. 40 individual drones had managed to find the hull, a number that seemed impossible given the layers of defense they had crossed. The flight deck was a graveyard of scorched steel and shattered composite materials. The air smelled of burning, rubber, hot metal, and something worse, the scent of a superpower's flagship that had been touched by fire. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, no longer the hunter. It was a wounded Titan, its crew exhausted and covered in ash, standing guard over a deck that would not see an aircraft launch for a very long time. 3 in the morning, the destroyer DDG-87, USS Mason, was already surging to 30 knots, its bow slicing through the black swells of the North Arabian Sea. The ship was moving into a position that every sailor in the fleet trained for but hoped never to execute: the physical screening of a wounded aircraft carrier. To the west, 20 new radar contacts had just emerged from the coastal clutter, a fresh wave of Iranian drones launched specifically to exploit the chaos on the Eisenhower's flight deck. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and the distant, acrid stench of the carrier's fires, while a thin mist began to settle over the water, obscuring the horizon. But not the glowing thermal signatures on the radar displays. The commanding officer of the Mason stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the tactical plot. The Dwight D. Eisenhower was currently a restricted maneuver target. Its speed dropped to 15 knots as damage control teams fought the inferno in the hangar bay. The carrier was vulnerable, its starboard side an open wound of twisted metal and smoke. The 20 incoming drones were approaching at an altitude of only 10 meters, flying in a tight finger four formation that suggested a higher level of guidance than the previous waves. "All ahead flank," the commander ordered, his voice steady despite the vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines roaring beneath his feet. "Position us 500 yards off the Ike's starboard quarter. We are the shield. Nothing gets past us." The destroyer pivoted with a violent grace, its hull leaning 10 degrees as it cut across the carrier's wake. At the same time, the cruiser CG-67, the Philippine Sea, moved to close the gap from the bow. The 2 escort ships were forming a wall of steel, placing their own armored hulls and sophisticated weapon systems between the suicide drones and the carrier's flight deck. The sound of the wind screaming past the bridge windows was drowned out by the mechanical growl of the 5-inch gun turret on the Mason's foredeck as it slewed toward the new threat. At a range of 8 kilometers, the Mason began the engagement. The 5-inch 62 caliber naval gun barked every 2 seconds, sending high explosive, electronically fused projectiles into the path of the oncoming swarm. Each detonation created a wall of shrapnel in the air, a flak curtain designed to shred the delicate carbon fiber wings of the foreign military drones. The flashes of the muzzle blasts illuminated the sea in rhythmic bursts of orange light, casting the silhouette of the wounded carrier in stark relief against the dark sky. "Multiple splashes," the tactical action officer reported. 3 targets neutralized by the 5-inch. But they are corrected. The remaining 17 are splitting high and low. The drones were no longer just flying straight lines. They began to perform erratic jinking maneuvers, diving and climbing to avoid the predicted path of the shells. This was the moment the naval destroyer transitioned to its inner-tier weapons. On the port and starboard sides, the close-in weapon systems began their terrifying, high-speed chatter. The white radomes looked like hunting predators, tracking the small, fast-moving shapes through the thick black smoke drifting from the carrier. The evolved Sea Sparrow missiles hissed out of their vertical launch cells, 4 at a time. These missiles were designed for exactly this scenario. High-agility intercepts at short range. As it corkscrewed through the air, its seeker head locked onto the friction heat of the drone engines. At coordinates 24 degrees 10 minutes north, 104 degrees 58 minutes east, the sky erupted in a sequence of 7 distinct explosions. The debris rained down into the ocean, creating a series of white splashes that were immediately swallowed by the carrier's massive wake. Inside the carrier, The crew could hear the thump 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 of the destroyer's guns echoing through the hull. The sound provided a grim sense of comfort to the firefighters on the deck. A reminder that they were not alone, in the dark. The coordination between the ships was a masterpiece of naval warfare. The naval destroyer and the naval warship were sharing a common tactical picture, ensuring that their defensive fire overlapped without ever endangering each other or the carrier they were protecting. By 3:15 in the morning, the second wave had been reduced to 3 surviving drones. These 3, however, were the most sophisticated of the group, equipped with anti-radiation seekers that allowed them to home in on the naval destroyer's own radar emissions. They dove toward the destroyer at 200 kilometers per hour, their small engines whining like angry hornets. The naval destroyer's crew didn't flinch. The starboard machine gun teams opened fire with their 50 caliber barrels, a stream of red tracers reaching out to meet the attackers. The first drone was chewed to pieces only 50 meters from the hull, its engine falling into the water while the warhead skipped harmlessly across the surface. The second was caught by a burst from the close-in weapon system and disintegrated in a mid-air fireball. The final drone, damaged by small arms fire, lost its guidance and tumbled into the sea 300 meters short of the carrier's stern. The immediate threat of the second wave was over. The wall of steel had held. The naval destroyer and the naval warship remained on station, their barrels smoking and their radar arrays still spinning, while the carrier behind them continued its desperate struggle against the fires within. The North Arabian Sea was quiet again, save for the roar of the carrier's ventilation fans and the distant, rhythmic splashing of the waves against the destroyer's hull. 3:30 in the morning. High above the burning silhouette of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, a single EA-18 Golf Growler from Electronic Attack Squadron 131 circled in a tight, protective orbit. The pilot and the electronic warfare officer in the rear seat were no longer looking through the canopy at the physical world. Instead, they were immersed in the invisible landscape of the electromagnetic spectrum, where the battle for the carrier's survival was now being fought with pulses of high-energy radiation rather than lead and steel. The cockpit was a cramped environment of glowing green multifunction displays, and the constant, rhythmic clicking of the cooling systems for the ALQ-99 jamming pods mounted beneath the wings. The air inside the jet tasted of dry, compressed oxygen and the faint, metallic scent of heated avionics. Outside, the ionized air around the jamming pods hummed with a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the pilot's teeth. The electronic warfare officer adjusted a series of dials on his console, his eyes tracking a cluster of low-power radio signals emerging from the Iranian coastline, 180 kilometers to the north. Viking 1-1. We have a firm lock on the uplink frequency, the electronic warfare officer reported, his voice calm despite the static crackling in his headset. The swarm is receiving mid-course corrections on the 340 MHz band. Initiating the Sunder protocol. Broad spectrum noise in 3, 2, 1. Electronic noise, a digital wall that effectively blinded the remaining drones in the air. On the carrier's radar screens, which were already struggling with the thick black smoke from the hangar fires, the picture began to clear as the Growler's systems filtered out the Iranian spoofing signals. The electronic warfare officer was not just jamming the drones, he was performing a surgical noise injection that tricked the Shahed navigation computers into believing they were hundreds of meters off course. Down on the Dwight D. Eisenhower, the primary radar systems, including the ANSPY-1 arrays, were suffering from thermal bloom caused by the intense heat of the fires on the flight deck. The radar operators reported that the smoke was acting as a physical barrier, reflecting the radar energy, and creating a dead zone directly above the ship. This was the most dangerous phase for the carrier's defense. If another wave of drones arrived while the primary sensors were blinded by smoke, the ship would have no way to guide its remaining missiles. Bridge, combat. The radar supervisor called out. We have lost tracking on the inner 5 miles due to smoke interference. We are relying entirely on the Growler's remote data link. If we lose that link, we are flying blind. The EA-18 Golf Growler moved into a lower orbit, flying directly through the rising plume of black smoke to maintain a line-of-sight connection with the carrier's secondary receivers. The pilot could smell the acrid stench of the carrier's burning jet fuel, even through the aircraft's advanced filtration system. The static on the radio increased, a chaotic hiss that represented the intense electronic struggle taking place between the American jammers and the Iranian ground stations. The result of the electronic attack was immediate. 20 miles out, a small group of 6 drones that had been loitering for a final strike began to wobble in the air. Their internal gyroscopes, deprived of stable GPS and command updates, failed to compensate for the heavy sea winds. One by one, the red icons on the Growler's tactical display began to spin in circles before plummeting into the dark water of the North Arabian Sea. The Growler had successfully severed the digital thread that connected the swarm to its masters. By 3:45 in the morning, the electromagnetic spectrum around the strike group was silent, dominated entirely by the overwhelming power of the American jamming pods. The radar dead zone remained a physical reality due to the smoke, but the electronic shield provided by the EA-18 Golf Growler had bought the damage control teams the time they needed to stabilize the ship without the threat of a secondary strike. 4 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea and the smoke-choked flight deck of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. The primary radar was still blind from the thermal bloom of the hangar fires, but the visual lookouts on the high-mounted signal bridge were the first to see the final 5 silhouettes emerging from the gray mist. These were the leakers, the final remnants of the 100-drone swarm that had navigated the electronic noise and the missile screen, and they were now less than 2 kilometers from the carrier's island. The air was a thick, toxic curtain of black smoke and salt spray, smelling of burnt hydraulic fluid and the sharp, metallic tang of hot machine gun barrels. The final line of defense was not a computer-guided missile or an automated cannon, but the human eyes and steady hands of the helicopter crews and deck gunners. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, call sign Dusty 3 and Dusty 4, had been orbiting the carrier's port side, their crews squinting through night vision goggles that turned the world into a grainy, electric green. As the drones were spotted, the pilots banked their aircraft into aggressive pursuit curve, the rotor blades beating against the heavy night air, with a rhythmic, chest-thumping vibration. Tally-ho! 5 targets. Low and slow at our 3 o'clock, the door gunner on Dusty 3 called out over the intercom. He braced his boots against the cabin floor and gripped the spade grips of the GAU-21 50 caliber machine gun. The helicopter surged forward, the wind screaming through the open cabin door at 140 knots. The gunner didn't wait for a computer lock. He used the glowing red trace of his ammunition to walk the fire onto the lead drone. The 50 caliber gun erupted, a heavy, mechanical thump-thump-thump that shook the entire frame of the helicopter. A stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds reached out across the 200 meters of open water, the red tracers slicing through the darkness. The first drone was hit in the midsection, its plastic fuselage shattering into a cloud of debris that was instantly swallowed by the sea. The gunner didn't pause, immediately slewing the heavy barrel toward the second target, which was attempting to dive toward the carrier's waterline. On the Eisenhower's starboard catwalks, the manual machine gun nests were also engaging. Sailors who had spent the last hour hauling fire hoses now gripped M240 Bravo machine guns, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. The sound of the small arms fire was a frantic, overlapping chatter that rose above the roar of the ship's ventilation fans. The sky was filled with cross-hatched lines of tracer fire. As the sailors and the helicopter gunners converged on the remaining targets, the final drone was less than 500 meters from the carrier's stern, when a burst from a deck-mounted 50 caliber gun caught its fuel cell. The drone erupted in a small, brilliant flash of orange light, the explosion reflecting off the white foam of the ship's wake. For a moment, the sky was illuminated, revealing the shattered remains of the flight deck and the exhausted faces of the men and women at the guns. As the last piece of debris hit the water, A sudden, heavy silence fell over the ship, broken only by the hiss of the firefighting foam and the distant, fading drone of the helicopter engines. All targets neutralized. The tactical action officer reported to the bridge, his voice thick with fatigue. The airspace is clear. I repeat. The airspace is clear. The last intercept was over. The Iranian swarm had been spent, reduced to thousands of pieces of carbon fiber and plastic floating in the North Arabian Sea. On the flight deck of the Eisenhower, the sailors didn't cheer. They simply lowered their weapons and turned back toward the fires that were still smoldering in the hangar bay. The sun was beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long, pale light over a carrier that had survived a 100-point attack, but at a cost that was only beginning to be understood. 6 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. The sun began to rise over a horizon that had been a wall of fire only 3 hours earlier. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was still moving at 15 knots, its hull cutting through the gray swells as the first light of dawn revealed the full extent of the carnage. The air was a mixture of cool morning salt and the lingering, heavy stench of burnt plastic and JP-5 jet fuel. The black smoke that had dominated the night had thinned to a gray haze, drifting lazily from the jagged holes in the carrier's starboard side. The initial damage assessment was a list that read like a structural failure report. In total, 40 Iranian drones had made physical contact with the ship's skin and flight deck. It was the most significant damage sustained by a United States Navy capital ship since the Second World War. 15 impacts had occurred along the starboard sponsons and hangar bay doors, where the drones had exploited the openings to detonate their warheads against the interior bulkheads. 12 drones had struck the flight deck itself, carving craters into the non-skid surface and turning the parked aircraft into twisted skeletons of blackened titanium. 3 drones had hit the island superstructure, shattering the glass of the primary flight control station and damaging several secondary radar arrays. The human cost was heavy, but the professional discipline of the crew had prevented a catastrophe. 12 sailors had been killed in action, most of them in the initial breach of Hangar Bay 2 during the first beat of the climax. 45 others were being treated for burns, shrapnel wounds, and smoke inhalation in the ship's primary medical ward. The medical teams had worked through the night in the dim glow of emergency lighting, their scrubs stained with the blood of their shipmates as they performed life-saving surgeries while the ship was still under attack. In terms of material losses, the price of the defense was staggering. 6 FA-18 Super Hornets were total losses. Their airframes melted into the deck by the intense heat of the fuel fires. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters had been damaged by shrapnel, and over 60% of the ship's starboard side lifeboats and firefighting stations had been obliterated. The cruiser Philippine Sea and the destroyer Mason reported no casualties, but they had expended nearly 80% of their surface-to-air missile inventory in the space of 90 minutes. Despite the scars, the strategic reality remained clear. The Iranian objective, the sinking or total neutralization of a United States Navy supercarrier, had failed. The Dwight D. Eisenhower was wounded, but it was not broken. The nuclear reactors remained fully operational, and the primary command and control centers had survived the impacts. By 7 in the morning, the damage control teams had successfully extinguished all major fires, and the hangar deck had been cleared of the most dangerous debris. The ship was listing 2 degrees to starboard, a manageable angle that the engineers were already correcting by shifting internal ballast. The commander of the strike group stood on the bridge, looking out at the scorched flight deck. He watched as a team of sailors began the slow, manual process of painting a white X over the largest crater on the deck. The Eisenhower would not be launching aircraft today, but it was still a sovereign piece of American territory, and it was moving, under its own power, toward the safety of the naval facilities at Jebel Ali. In the history of naval warfare and survived to tell the tale. The Battle of the North Arabian Sea was over. The foreign military swarm had been an innovative and brutal challenge to American naval supremacy, proving that even the most sophisticated defenses could be saturated by sheer numbers. However, the response of the military forces had been equally definitive. The wall of steel had held, just enough to ensure the survival of the flagship. As the aircraft carrier turned its bow toward the west, it left behind a sea filled with the fragments of 100 drones and a lesson that would be studied at the Naval War College for decades to come. The morning light finally broke through the haze, illuminating the American flag flying from the carrier's mast. It was tattered and gray from the smoke, but it was still there. The Dwight D. Eisenhower would return to the fight, its hull eventually repaired and its deck replaced, but the memory of the night the Iron Swarm came would remain etched into the steel of the ship and the minds of every sailor who had stood the watch.